Hi, my name is Craig Alpert, film editor of DC Entertainment's Blue Beetle. What you're seeing on screen right now is my final timeline, which is all 7 reels strung together. The movie's roughly 2 hours and 10 minutes, so the first 6 reels have close to 20 minutes footage on them, and the final reel has about 10 minutes on there. We usually like to break the reels up because it's easier for the sound crew to work, visual effects crew as well. Back in the film days, when we were conforming negative, they normally didn't like the reels over 2,000 feet, which is around 21 minutes. Let's take a look now about how the film evolved. So we'll go back to my earlier versions of the cut. So version 1 was my original version. As you can tell, it looks quite different from our final version. I still have roughly 4 video tracks and 11 audio tracks. The blue is all the temp music. The darkish yellow are our temporary sound effects. The bright yellow is effects that we were beginning to receive from our sound crew. We were fortunate enough to have them on earlier in the process. So as my assembly was completed, they came on. It was Andrew Cristofaro and Darren Warkington, amazing sound supervisors. You'll also see down on audio track 3, the brown clips. As always in a lot of films, the dialogue sometimes sounds a bit rough. So they began to go through to clean up and reduce noise in the tracks. So you'll see anywhere that I used it, I muted my production audio tracks on A1. If you notice the orange clips on V1, those have been color-coded to signify that they've been turned over to visual effects and work has begun on the shots. At that point, I keep in mind if I extend shots or make significant changes to them, to either notify visual effects or have the visual effects editors make a pass at the cut. The white clips on V2 are temp comps that our visual effects editor did through production and through the early stages of editing to remove green screens or add missing elements. And the green clips on V3 are composites received from visual effects. As you can see in this reel, I don't label my tracks early on. I do later in the process, but I'm making so many changes, moving scenes around and moving clips around, that I prefer not to keep labeling them. But I do prefer to keep dialogue on tracks 1 through 4, effects on 5 through 8, and music 9, 10, and 11. You'll see in the later reels, obviously, that changes. Reel 1's a fairly simple reel. Let's go to reel 2 version 1. This is still pretty close to my assembly. You'll see on video track 1, we have a few production clips labeled pink. That signifies that the shot has been pulled and turned over to post-viz. We usually do post-viz if we're not ready to hand over the shot to the real visual effects vendor. In post-viz, it allows us to play around more with the concepts and what the shot will actually look like. Then once we sign off on post-viz, the shots are turned orange and turned over to the visual effects vendor. In reel 2, we have the first 2 action scenes in the movie. The one we'll focus on is the transformation scene, which is called SCJ. For those of you that have seen the movie, it's where Jaime transforms for the first time. And then Beetle's first flight, which is labeled BFF on the clips. That's the visual effects abbreviation for the clip. That's where he shoots up into space and then takes the ride through the city and splits the bus. Right after my assembly was completed, we decided to bring Sholo in to record his first ADR session. Those clips are labeled pink. I like bright colors for ADR, so it's much easier to see in the timeline. For the most part, I still have temporary effects in this reel. The dark yellows are clips that we have cut, and the bright yellow clips are from the sound crew. You'll see we have locators on the timeline as well. I usually like the visual effects crew to drop white locators and type the visual effects name for every clip in the film. They also add timeline notes on the clips as well and add the visual effects name as well. Usually when the shot is turned over, we add the date on the white locator Just makes it easier for me to know when I have the marker tool open what shot is in progress and what is not. We usually get to a point in the visual effects process where they prefer that we don't extend shots or make significant changes to them, or it costs a little bit of money. So I try to keep everyone in the loop as we're going. There's also red locators down on audio tracks 1, 2, and 3 on the ADR. When the assistant editors break down the ADR clips, they drop red locators at the start of every read and type what the dialogue is. Sometimes we leave the mic open and the actors read a bunch of different lines, so it makes it easier for me to find in the marker tool if they type what's being said. I also drop yellow locators in areas where I have notes to go back and fix. It's just a reminder for me to relook at the edit that I did while I was in the room with the director. Each sequence goes through multiple versions. If we move now to Reel 2 version 4, it's probably a few months into the process, you'll see significant changes in the timeline. I'm now working with crash downs from the sound crew. At this point, we have a full sound crew working on, and I'd like to get rid of the temp sound effects as soon as possible, because rarely we cut anything ourselves in the Avid that we want to keep, almost never. So I'll explain what the tracks are at this point. So I've begun to label the tracks. A1 through 4 are still dialogue, but there's no need for me to label those. Reel 5 is the ADR crash down from the sound crew. We had quite a bit of ADR in the movie, so they usually take it back and process it to have it sound like it's mixed correctly with everything else. Audio track 6 is the dialogue stem, which is all the production dialogue smoothed out and mixed so it sounds a bit better. A7, 8, and 9 are the effects crash downs. A7, we tried to focus more on the designy effects, the bug suits, explosions, guns. Track 8 are our stereo effects, everything else. And track 9 are our backgrounds. Track 10 and 11 are music as well, which our music editors have now replaced all my terrible temp music that I cut in. You'll see as we return to the transformation and Beetle's first flight sequence, there are now orange clips in the dialogue tracks. The orange clips have come from our dialogue supervisor. That's also ADR or dialogue fixes that have been cut in. I like them to look a little different so I know that I can't match back and go to the original bin that has the source material in it. You'll also see on the video tracks I have a few layers of visual effects at this point. They're still all temps because they're labeled green. I prefer not to have more than 4 or 5 versions of shots stacked up. So as we get multiple versions in, the VFX editors collapse older versions of the shots down. So we're usually only showing 4 or 5 versions. You'll see on video tracks 1 and 2, I have a few Avid effects there. A flop here and there, but mostly resizes to frame out either something in the shot that we didn't want to see or to resize the shot so it's a little closer. I also have a few speed effects as well to speed up shots that we mainly use with the stunt work. On V8, my top video track, we have a color correction track. My first assistant / additional editor, Brandon, went through and color corrected a bunch of shots, and we also had someone come in for a few days to help us before preview. I normally like to keep all the color correction on a different layer. So as I'm recutting scenes down below and changing shots, I don't have to reapply the color correction on them. As you can see, it's pretty chopped up, but the majority of the color correction was done on a scene-by-scene basis rather than a shot-by-shot basis, since the majority of the shots matched. Let's jump ahead to version 8. It's pretty close to where we ended up in the final version, as we had 10 versions of the film. So we'll jump into Reel 4. You'll notice now we have clips colored purple. Those are final visual effects shots. For a short time, I usually keep the temp comps underneath until we know we won't be going back and making any changes in them. But then the visual effects editors collapse those video tracks down to 1 or 2. I like cleaner timelines. The least amount of tracks, the better for me. Some people like to have a lot. I just prefer a little. You'll also notice, like the previous reel, the majority of the dialogue on audio tracks 1, 2, 3, and 4 have been muted since I'm still cutting with updated crash downs. These crash downs are labeled temp 4, so this was our 4th temp mix that we had on stage. I'm guessing this was probably shortly before our 4th audience preview. All my crash downs are stereo, since on this show I was only working 2-channel stereo. Sometimes I work LCR with 3 channels, and on one show I worked 6-track. You'll also notice a few clips have cyan locators. Not so many in this reel, but more in others. Our visual effects editors add cyan locators on new visual effects shots that have been cut in. Every morning before I begin editing, I open up every reel and review all the visual effects shots. As I do, I remove the cyan locator. As we're late in the process like we are right now in version 8, we can receive up to 50 to 60 shots a day. You'll notice in version 8, I've added an A10 group track. At this point, we've recorded group ADR, which is all the actors that do the voices of the guards and the crowds and all that. So I'm carrying that track along as well, in addition to the ADR and the dialogue track. Let's move later in the film, later up in the process, as we're at version 10 right now, reel 6. You'll see the timeline looks a little different at this point. I've asked the visual effects editor to remove all the temp visual effects and only have our finals. This is pretty close to the lock cut of the film towards the end. On V8, you'll notice there's an IMAX track. Our film was shot and designed to be played in IMAX, but not the entire film. The aspect ratio of the film is 240. IMAX ratio is 190. So everything within the lens was framed 2 ways. We had to signify in the cut what scenes we were going to open up to 190. So we just created an IMAX title on the top track. The majority of the third act is IMAX, which is why this title covers most of reel 6. The IMAX title on screen appeared in the bottom left. IMAX just doesn't influence the visuals, it also influences the audio. We kept the title running on V8 for ourselves to signify what we were going to be playing IMAX, but also so the sound crew would know as well. Since the aspect ratio of the final film is 240, a percentage of the bottom and the top of the frame is cropped, but IMAX 190 is pretty close to the full frame of our show. There are actions happening in the IMAX shots in 190 that you would not normally see in 240, like footsteps and other stuff like that. So the sound crew made sure to cover all of that throughout the whole film. You'll notice down on A12, one of my music tracks, we have light blue music. That's score from the composer. I like to know what score and what is temp score, so by labeling it light blue, it stands out a bit more. Down on A13 and A14 is additional new ADR. Since we were pretty close to finishing the movie, I cut the audio down on lower tracks so it was easier for the sound crew to see what was different than what was up above. We had already begun our final mix, so at that point, I wanted to make sure that the correct ADR ended up in the film. Which it would have, they would have seen it anyway, but down on the lower tracks, it was easier for them to see. So as we move ahead to the final reel of the movie, this is reel 7. It's quite a bit shorter than the other reels. There's really only about maybe 5 minutes of actual scenes in here. The rest is end credits and end tag. The white clips are our end crawl. The end crawl was broken up into 2 pieces since we had an end tag play in between the start of the crawl and the main crawl. So to close this out, let's go back to the final strung together version of Blue Beetle. All 7 reels tied together, including our main title sequence and our end crawl. Thanks for listening, and I hope you can see Blue Beetle. It's a really wonderful movie.